guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back for another episode in my history series, where today we're going to be learning about the Great Smog of London from 1952. And I promise you, it's much more interesting than you would believe from that title. Or maybe I'm just a big old nerd, either or. You know how much I love talking about the history of London. Every time I think I found the last big interesting thing, there's always something else waiting around the corner for me, and I love it. This is probably going to be quite a short episode, but hey, sometimes something quick to listen to whilst you're busy is quite nice. But maybe this isn't nice, because the event we're going to cover today, London's Great Smog of 1952, actually left thousands dead. But before we get on with the video, I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, NordVPN. Telling the kinds of stories I do on my channel from all over the world, thanks to GDPR rules, I often encounter the whole "this page is not available in your country" problem. For years, this was a huge roadblock for me when it came to researching certain cases, something that's no longer a problem with a VPN, in which I can connect servers from across the world. That might be a very niche problem for me and my specific job, but a VPN can unlock so much more of the internet for you and help keep you safer whilst browsing. NordVPN is easy to use, enabling you to connect with just one click, or you can enable auto connect for zero-click protection. They have 5,400 plus servers in 60 countries, meaning that you can pick and choose whatever server works for you, whether that's the fastest speed, or maybe there's a particular TV show you want to watch that's only available on Netflix in a certain country. I'm looking at you, New Girl. I'm still fuming that they took New Girl off UK Netflix, but at least I can virtually pop over to the USA for my daily New Girl fix. NordVPN can unlock so many more shows and movies for you, and you can even find streaming platforms at a lower price. And with summer coming up, many of us are going to be away on our first holidays in years. I know I will be, and I'll be using NordVPN in reverse, staying at home virtually so I can keep up to date with all of my favourite shows. For the techies of you, for extra protection with NordVPN, you can route your traffic through 2 VPN servers, doubling the encryption, and there's an automatic kill switch, meaning that if the VPN connection accidentally drops, it blocks the device you're using from accessing the web. For gamers, you can access games that aren't available in your location and find discounts in other regions. You can unblock your favourite games and geo-restricted servers, meaning there's no limit to where you can play. I'll admit I'm not much of a gamer myself, but my girlfriend very much is, and she's very excited by the possibilities here. There are so many advantages to using a VPN, and tests have proven that NordVPN is the fastest one out there. You can use each account on up to 6 different devices, and it's available on every major platform: Windows, Android, iOS, macOS and Linux. Even your Android TV supports NordVPN, so yes, you can watch those shows only available abroad on your TV. You can use the link in the description, nordvpn.com/GeorgiaMarie, to get 72% off a 2-year plan with a 30-day money-back guarantee. You will not regret it. If you've ever watched any of my other London history videos, you'll know that London doesn't exactly have a reputation for being the cleanest of cities. In fact, more often than not throughout history, it's been rife with disease, the Thames running through the centre being one of the most polluted rivers in the world, with people just throwing their waste into it. In 1858, hot weather aggravated the waste in the river so much that it caused the Great Stink of London, forcing Parliament to finally get a sewer system in place. So yeah, London has been gross. For well over a century leading up to 1952, Britain had been affected by thick mists and fogs. The Industrial Revolution had come round in the latter half of the 1700s, and people had little to zero concept of the true effects pollution had on the planet. These massive factories popping up all over the country, pumping thick, poisonous gases into the atmosphere. And that would cause this thick fog or smog. But it wasn't quite as simple as this gas just hanging around in the air and dirtying it up. The particles in these gases that the factories are just pumping out into the air would cling on to tiny water particles, meaning that the gases would also hang around. As you can probably guess, these pollutants hanging around in the air wasn't exactly the best for people's health. When some chemicals mix with water and air, they can turn into acid, which can cause skin irritation and breathing problems. I can imagine if you had asthma back in the 18th and 19th centuries, you would probably struggle a lot more than you would today. And you could always tell when it was this poisonous smog as opposed to a regular weather phenomenon of fog. Smog is foul smelling and off coloured, it's yellow or brown. The term smog itself comes from an amalgamation of fog and smoke. You mix the two together, you get smog. By the time 1952 rolled around, London's air was in a particularly bad way. Throughout World War II, factory production had been in overdrive, and the city was reliant on coal-fired power plants for electricity and heat, of which there were many, and diesel-powered buses for public transport. They had fairly recently replaced the city's electric tram system. Nearing the end of the year, that winter was also a particularly cold one, meaning that Londoners were also burning more coal in their homes than usual in an attempt to keep themselves warm. At this time, London was the world's biggest city, with 8 million residents, and every single home used open fires to heat themselves. On top of this, the coal that both the regular people and the factories was burning at this point was poor quality and released a large amount of sulphur dioxide in its smoke. The better quality coal was being exported to pay off debts after World War II. The government would have known that a lot of this was causing problems, but they didn't do much to prevent it. Of course, it's the British government. On December 5th, 1952, the day started with clear skies, a brisk winter's morning, but as the day progressed, a thick fog descended on the city. Within hours, the fog had turned into smog, the thick yellow air that so many residents knew well. Londoners went about their days as usual, of course, but it soon became clear that this smog was worse than normal. It was thicker, darker, and didn't seem to be budging. Why was it worse this day than any other? Well, it was kind of the perfect storm, no pun intended, of the general pollution levels and the perfect combination of weather. That morning the sky was clear, there was only a very light wind and the lowest air was fairly moist. An anticyclone had settled above the city, so without getting all technical about something I don't fully understand, the ground cooled, and when the moist air came into contact with the ground, it cooled itself and condensation occurred. Then this very light wind stirred up this slightly wet air upwards, and remember when I spoke before about tiny gas particles from pollution clinging to the water particles? Well, that happened, forming a thick smog. It kind of created its own ecosystem above London, the atmosphere beneath the anticyclone trapping itself in, containing the smoke from the chimneys of homes, businesses and factories. According to the Met Office, the following pollutants were being released into the city every day during the smog: 1,000 tonnes of smoke particles, 2,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide, 140 tonnes of hydrochloric acid, and 14 tonnes of fluorine compounds. But even more dangerously, there were 370 tonnes of sulphur dioxide being released, which converted into 800 tonnes of sulphuric acid. As you can imagine, the city stank. The smog was 200 feet deep across the city. There was no escape. This type of fog was often called a pea souper or pea soup fog, the name first being used back in 1820 by an artist called John Sartain because it matched the colour and thickness of pea soup. This thick, acrid smog would hang around London for 5 days and completely paralyse the city. Whilst on the first day that British attitude of persevering and pretending nothing's wrong took over, it very quickly became clear that things were not okay. Due to the poor visibility, boats on the River Thames had to come to a standstill, flights were grounded, and trains in and out of the city were cancelled. The middle of the day felt like night time, and drivers were forced to turn on their car headlights, and even that was dangerous. You simply couldn't see in front of you. Visibility was less than a metre. Bus conductors were forced to walk ahead of the buses to guide them through the smog. If you were lucky, you had a flare to light the way. Police used flames around Marble Arch to guide the traffic and prevent crashes, but of course you can imagine there were many in the very first days. Travel was disrupted for the entire length of the smog, and you couldn't even just walk anywhere. Just taking a few steps outside would leave you wheezing. And there was no escape either. Cinemas and theatres had to be closed as people simply couldn't see the stage. Even going inside, you couldn't escape the smog. Authorities advised parents to keep their children home from school in fear they would get lost in the fog, and criminals took their chance. Burglaries and petty theft increased hugely as perpetrators could easily slip through the darkness unseen. Football games had to be cancelled, although according to history.com, Oxford and Cambridge were able to carry on with their annual cross-country competition at Wimbledon Common thanks to track marshals shouting, this way, Oxford and Cambridge. Runners had to rely on their ears more than anything else. That's quite funny to think about, but the reality of all this was not funny, it was lethal. Although we don't have exact numbers of the dead because the effects of this will be felt for many years after, it's thought that at least 4,000 people lost their lives in these 5 days. Other sources quote as many as 10,000 or 12,000. If you already had compromised lungs due to smoking, which was very popular at the time, or respiratory issues, you were barely able to breathe. Pharmacies did sell smog masks, but most people couldn't afford such a luxury, and this was such an unprecedented smog that even the masks didn't really help. In the days of the smog and the days immediately following, deaths from bronchitis and pneumonia increased more than 7-fold, whilst in the East End this increased to 9-fold. And not all of the deaths were due to respiratory problems either. Loads of people literally walked into the Thames and drowned in their disorientation, or walked in front of vehicles. A huge percentage of fatalities were the most elderly or the youngest of society. And although it definitely was at its worst in London, this smog would spread over the country over the coming days. The deaths didn't stop once the fog eventually lifted on the 9th of December, when a strong wind from the west finally swept the smog away. Mortality rates remained elevated for many months afterwards, well into the summer of 1953. Whilst a preliminary report blamed this on an influenza epidemic, it wasn't. It was mostly respiratory tract infections, bronchopneumonia or purulent bronchitis. I've had bronchitis before and it was the most ill I have ever been. It's not something I ever want to relive. It was horrible, and the thought of it being a cause of death is chilling. There was no way really of knowing the long-term effects that this had on people's health. Maybe the deaths as a result continued for many, many years. There were so many deaths that the death industry struggled to keep up. There was a shortage of caskets, florists ran out of flowers, graveyards ran out of plots. And humans, of course, weren't the only ones affected. Cattle at the famous Smithfield show are said to have choked to death, forcing breeders to improvise gas masks for their cows. And birds flew full speed into buildings, dying on impact as they simply couldn't see them. Same as with humans, any animals with pre-existing respiratory conditions struggled to survive. After this, the government simply couldn't ignore the impact of smog any longer. Whilst they were initially slow to respond, as always, to the smog whilst it was happening, there was a committee set up in the aftermath that identified the source as the smog as pollution from solid fuels. This led to Parliament passing the Clean Air Act of 1956, which essentially prohibited dark smoke from chimneys. New furnaces were to be smokeless as far as practical, density meters were to be installed to record the density or darkness of smoke emitted from buildings, grit and dust was to be minimised, smoke-free zones were to be put in, and so on. I think it was actually one of the first anti-pollution bills put in all of the world. The regular person was given financial incentives to replace open coal fires with safer alternatives such as gas fires, or the opportunity to burn coke instead of coal. No, not the drink or the drug, it's basically a coal alternative that produced minimal smoke. And over the next decade or so, central heating became much more commonplace. But despite all of this being put in place, things didn't improve immediately. There was actually another London smog in 1962 that killed 750 people, an improvement on thousands but still not ideal. But after that, the air seemed to clear and it's never really happened again. Modern day pollution legislation and the wonders of central heating have ensured that it probably never will happen to London again, or generally in the United Kingdom. However, a law in the UK is not a law around the world. Many cities around the world still have huge problems with smog. Many factories and manufacturers are still pumping out obscene amounts of chemicals and God knows what into the atmosphere every single day. My research shows me that towns and cities across India and China tend to suffer the worst, along with Pakistan, Uganda, Bangladesh, Cameroon. Los Angeles in the USA and Mexico City in Mexico have much higher than average rates of smog as well. If you have respiratory problems, these are probably not the places to be. Hopefully over the coming years further legislation will come in across the world to make a change in this, because the amount of people that must be suffering because of this and probably not even realising must be huge. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found this one as interesting as I did, and let me know if there are any other dark history of London stories that you want me to share. I really do feel like I'm coming to the end of my list, but there must be more. There must be so much more. I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.